What is up, team? EPL, Ethos, Pathos, Eternal Logos, back at you with another podcast. So sorry that I have been gone for so long. If you have been following the podcast, I was trying to do them relatively frequently, but recently I got super duper busy and just hadn't had an opportunity to do another podcast. And I was really trying. Anybody who's like had contact with me over this time period knows I've been like, I'm going to do another podcast. And this one is particularly a special one because I am going to be doing this podcast, and it is the last podcast that I'll be doing in this house that I'm currently living in right now. So when I say I've been busy, I have been busy. There's really cool things happening in my life right now, which kind of also inspired the topic of tonight. As you can see, there's a trash bag right there, and then some more stuff being packed and outside the door. I mean, the house it's in shambles at the moment. Mostly all packed up, about 85 to 90% done. Just finished packing the kitchen today. But like I said, it's been great. It's been fun. It's been busy, but I have missed doing the podcast because this is something that I've been, as I've said multiple times before, been trying to dedicate myself to making sure that I do something at least relatively regularly. And if you've been following me, you kind of know that from all of the other videos that I've done, which is not a great number, but we are trying to get consistent in that at least. So thank you guys for tuning back in as always. For everybody who's been listening to the podcast, again, sorry I've been away for so long, but there is a reasonable good explanation for that, as you can see. And I wanted to make sure I did one in this house before I left this house. And it's really a special time for me. So over the last couple of weeks or so, I've been trying to decide what my topic was going to be. I've asked a few people, kind of to get some ideas, those kinds of things. But I thought tonight, because of all the things that's been happening and the fact that I'm moving, I thought change would be a fantastic topic. And if you're looking at the thumbnail, I probably put that in the thumbnail, change of, in some wording or something like that to let you know what the podcast is going to be about. But change is an interesting concept. And in my opinion, there obviously has to be balance when it comes to change, because there are good things that can happen for when things change in your life, and there can be bad things that can happen when change comes into your life. Sometimes it can be chaotic, sometimes it can be orderly, and unfortunately, because I'm obviously busy, this is probably going to be one of the shorter podcasts that I do. I'm going to try to keep it about 30 minutes or so, but we'll see. We know how I can kind of ramble a bit, as I already have, because you guys obviously want to hear about what we're going to be discussing tonight, less about my life. But so as always, what do we do at this podcast? We're trying to break things down, slow it down a bit. We're discussing the topic. So we first start with a definition, or at least making sure that we understand the term, how we're using the term, or how other people understand the term and how it's used, etc. So the definition, as defined, at least if you Google it, it's to make someone or something different, alter or modify. Definition 2, and I looked up both definitions, it is to replace with something else, especially something of the same kind that is newer or better. I think, well, let me start here. As I mentioned, there are really cool things happening in my life. So change. And some interesting things happening in the lives of people that are around me. Actually getting inspired, thinking about just got a text message from someone I've been talking to over the last couple of months, and it's been a great inspiration to me. So that's been something that's been going in my life. My brother, who is actually my distant brother, just got married, was at his wedding a week or so ago. My sister just moved into a sweet house on the beach, to list another thing. Like I said, I'm moving, and I also just turned 32 a couple of weeks back. Yes, about a couple of weeks back now. So, like I said, changes happening in my life, so I'm experiencing it right now. And I think the reason why I really kind of wanted to discuss this topic is because I think sometimes when people use change, when you get into sometimes philosophical debates, we use change as a metaphor. Some people hold change to be sort of a sort of life philosophy, which I'll dig into in a second. But I think people typically define change to be something along the lines of, at least philosophically, when I've had conversations with friends before, a lot of people will say things like, change is the only thing you can sort of be certain of, right? Or they'll say something along the lines of, the only thing you can sort of expect in life is that things are going to change. And I think sometimes that can come out of a place of fear. I think experiences can kind of teach you to be on guard when it comes to making sure things in your life are, or at least that you accept that things will change. I think the first way that people usually break it down to me, what I was mentioning a second ago in terms of change being the only thing that is consistent, I tend to disagree with that. I understand what people are saying, right? I've had one friend tell me, or at least define it as being, that change is sort of a constant flow, which I think we all understand sort of exactly what that means. And I do actually agree with that, right? Like things are constantly flowing, right? But like I said before, there has to sort of be balance, right? Change is a concept that is inevitable, but I think there are certain things in our lives that we ought to try to maintain for consistency's sake, right? Because there is definitely a order to having things be static. We can think of a ton of examples, right? You don't want to change so much or so often that you don't find stability, for instance. And I think as we tend to get older, these concepts that we sometimes tend to live by philosophically can, or at least we start to build certain parameters around them. For instance, when you're younger, you tend to do a lot of moving around. When you get older, you tend to want to stay still more often. I think it slows down a bit. And so I think there is, an ebb and flow to change and having, sort of being static in certain ways, in certain parts of your life, etc. Right. So I think I've always been the type of person that has appreciated what it means to have and hold a value. And even in my adult life now, when, I'm discussing these things, or even when I'm in debates and when I'm having discussions and talks with friends, I constantly am trying to maintain, or at least argue from a place of value, something that I truly believe in and something that I hold dear and something that I actually think is true. And I think those things that we hold to be true, that we've found to be true in our lives, those are things that we want to maintain in more of a static position, right? If you find something in your life to be true and it works conceptually, practically, or otherwise, you very much want that thing to more or less stay the same. Now, the interesting thing about change is when people make this statement, and this is one of those philosophical sort of thoughts. Paradox is probably isn't probably the best word, but when you think about if somebody says like change is the only thing that is certain, right? So you have this idea that change is constantly moving, but then to say that change is certain is to say that at least at some level you can expect certainty in change itself, right? Which in some ways change kind of implies uncertainty, if that makes sense, right? So if you follow me, it's one of those things. I got into a discussion with a friend some time ago, and we were talking about, and like I said, sometimes people hold this as to be a core philosophy in sort of what they tend to, or at least how they tend to live their lives, right? And so if you say, or at least let's just say you have an inherent fear about losing. So you decide to adopt this sort of change philosophy or principle to go throughout your life. And so you start to say that change is the only thing that's certain, right? But obviously the contradictory point to that is that, well, does change, or the philosophy or the value that you hold to be true about change, also change, right? And so you kind of get into this sort of philosophical paradox, and that's not necessarily where I'm going with this podcast. I just wanted to bring that up to kind of, because what we do on this podcast is we kind of try to strip down all the way to the bare bones of what we mean, philosophically, when we hold values to be true, etc. And we just want to dig far enough down to where we can start to really question or get at the core of what we're intended to mean. So the conversation that I was having with my friend, and this is the part that I agree with, is that change is something that you can expect that constantly flows, right? But again, I think even relying on this idea that change constantly flows, something about that you can expect, right? If change is constantly flowing, I can expect at least that, there's a constant in the flowing, so to speak. And so that's something that's reliable and it's static. And so my entire life, I've kind of always, at least at some level, understood the importance of maintaining, having discipline, and all those sorts of things. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that change can't be present in them. It just means that at some level you are sort of 10 toes down in what you believe in. And like I was saying before, empirically, I think all of us at some level are empiricists, right? When we experience new experiences in life, when we gain new evidences, those kinds of things, we tend to change or move from one position to the other. But there has to very oftentimes be something powerful enough to take us from one position A to position B, or at least to modify in some way, shape, or form what we believe about position A, even if you're not willing to make a full change to position B. And you can fill in the blank for whatever that thing might be, right? And you can take any topic or any concept that you hold to be true and all those kinds of things. And so I think it's important for us to remember that there's a balance, and I mentioned this at sort of the top of the podcast, that you have to be open to change, and there's something virtuous about moving out of your comfort zone, right? And sort of comfort zone and uncomfortability are, in this idea is change and static. If you can understand sort of what I mean by comfortability and uncomfortability. When you're comfortable, right, you tend to want to remain static and stay the same because you're happy with how things are going. When you're uncomfortable, there's something about that's changed that might oftentimes be, or at least feel negative. or make you uneasy about whatever that thing might be. But there has to always be balance, right? Because change can also bring about a certain, it can sort of be chaotic in a way, right? Something I've also thought about, and I'll probably return to this in a later podcast as well. But when we talk about experiences, people always say like experience is the best teacher. I've always understood that, but I've always sort of, I think again, probably maybe sort of had a balanced approach to it, right? Experience is a great teacher, but you can also learn from, you don't have to necessarily always experience something in order to learn from it, right? And it's probably because just maybe the way I think or maybe how I grew up and those kinds of things. But I've always thought that was something that you could do as human beings. I think it's something interesting about human beings that I can kind of sort of watch something take place and then make a value judgment on it, or make a call or say, hey, maybe that's not something I want to do because it doesn't look fun, right? And then there's value in that. And so experience being the best teacher, and sort of this idea of change and being a concept and utilizing that in our lives. Like I was saying, like change can sort of be chaotic in nature if you're not careful, which is why I think there's a lot of value in what I'm attempting to do with this podcast, which is kind of help people sort of learn the skills to basically be able to make quick evaluations, or at least practice, thinking through some of these ideas and concepts, right? Because oftentimes we can become so addicted to experiences. We can become so addicted to this idea of change and not wanting to be stagnant. But there's also value in the other side, right? And I think getting away from the extremities can really, really help us. Learn, because if you aren't willing to hold on to anything, it's like sometimes, you can sometimes be a certain way or learn a certain thing and it's solid. And if you allow yourself sort of to be moved from that thing, you can start to devalue what it is that you learned in the first place. And sometimes that learning can be a result of you having made a change somewhere else in your life, right? So you were here, you made a change, you learned something valuable, and then it's like, okay, well, should I change again, right? And then you move away from that thing that actually was valuable, and then later you learn like, oh, I should have paid attention a little bit sooner to that thing I actually found valuable, and held to it a little tighter, because now I'm in this position and I have to either relearn something or go back to, something that was good and that I found to learn in the first place, right? And so I think understanding the difference and understanding how those things work together is extremely important. And I think you can find this throughout your entire life. It doesn't necessarily have to just be in your personal life. It could be in your work life. There's obviously things that we learn on a daily basis. There's, interactions with other people, things that we take on to ourselves, our beliefs, our values, etc. Right? And so I think it's really cool when we can think about these concepts and really make sense of them, and then ultimately find balances where, I think where it's necessary to have balance. And I think there's necessary to have balance in everything virtually. And I thought about this the other day as well too, when it comes to extremities. And I guess the way that I'm sort of talking about change here and some of the ideas that I've heard people talk about when it comes to change and it being certain, or, and those kinds of things, is there is also seems to be a time and a place, right? This is a concept we can return to. It's like, oh, be balanced in this approach, but should you always be balanced? But isn't there a place also for extremities, right? Just as an idea, Like sometimes, or if we, how we define extremities to be like the improper use of something. So let me give you an example. I'm off on a bit of a tangent here, but just follow me. This is, this is what we do on this podcast. So let's just say, if you just take the concept of killing, right? Killing's an extreme, right? I think generally people would look at killing as being a bad thing, or an extreme way to handle a situation. And so sometimes if you just look at, if we take killing and it being an extreme and say, well, people would then build an exception, so to speak, right? And say, like, okay, well, it's not extreme in this circumstance, right? In the case of self-defense, say, right? So the question is, and maybe we can return to this in a later podcast, like change, because in this sort of way that we've been discussing change so far, we're kind of sort of using it in an extreme sense. And I think that's kind of my initial reason for fighting against or bringing up the concerns when I hear people say that, is because it's like, well, there's no balance and it seems to be an extreme. But just like killing as an extremity, we also can look at change and have it and understand that it's also can be taken to an extreme level when there is not a balance and an understanding of, well, change is appropriate at times and inappropriate at other times, and learning and understanding when that is a part of learning and growing, etc. So this is a pretty quick podcast. As I usually do, I ramble a little bit, which is okay. But this is definitely a concept that I think will come back up in a number of different debates, discussions, and topics that I will bring up on the podcast. And I'm interested to know, obviously, what everybody thinks. If you're interested, drop a comment, leave a like on the video, of course. And if you want, let me know, and we can talk about this and actually have an open forum and a discussion about it, because that's what we really want. We really want people to come in and bring in their ideas. And if you disagree with anything I've said or you agree with what I said, like I said, drop a comment. Let me know you want to debate. Let me know you want to come up and discuss onto the podcast, and we will make that happen. Again, I'm really, really sorry for being away for 3 months. The next podcast I do will be hopefully in my new home. And also, it's going to be really exciting because I'm going to try to have a new setup, maybe a different camera angle, maybe start switching. So we're going to try to make the podcast a little bit better in terms of quality and all of that stuff. So make sure you tune in. Again, thank you, everyone. There's so many things that are happening in my life right now that are going really well. As you can see, smiles are on my face. And speaking of change, right? Tomorrow is obviously not promised. But that's also a static idea, right? We know that, life is precious, and our time on this earth eventually will be up. And so that is a principle that we all take to heart, no matter who we are. When you're born, and as you get older, you start to understand that as an idea. There's a lot of things that have happened to me as well over the past couple of years, things in my personal life with my family, and there's some really cool things happening right now. And so I just thought that this would be a really cool topic to introduce, at least to the podcast. Again, we'll return to it, but make sure, if anything else, when you think about these ideas, really give some thought to it again, like I always say, and then really, really play devil's advocate to yourself sometimes and say, well, what does this mean? What are the philosophical implications of this? How am I defining this? Does this make sense? Because if we take change to an extremity, you will most likely find in your life instability. And I think that's something that everybody, that really no one wants. I think everybody to some degree wants stability in their life, in some way, shape, or form. And so that's a podcast. That's a wrap up. Thanks, everybody. We will be back. Appreciate you all. Have a fantastic night, and we will talk to you at the next one.